I will ask everybody to mute their mics. I'm Carlos Primo Braga. I'm an associate professor of Fundação Dom Cabral in Brazil. I'm speaking to you from São José dos Campos, Brazil. And as in previous webinars, we today have the opportunity to hear from one of the candidates to the position of WTO Director General. The Punta del Este Group, which is a network of Latin American academics, former ambassadors, former ministers, has been organizing these webinars for us to have an opportunity to hear the ideas of the candidates about the WTO, and particularly how they see the importance of the WTO for Latin American countries. Full disclosure, Ngozi was my boss in the past when she was the managing director of the World Bank, and I was the director of economic policy and debt. So I had the pleasure of working with her. Her resume is too long for me to read. She has an excellent academic background with Harvard and MIT PhD, and has been finance minister twice in Nigeria, also Minister of Foreign Affairs for a while, and as I already mentioned, had an illustrious career at the World Bank. So without much ado, I will ask Ngozi to start speaking to us on two initial issues. We all know that the WTO is currently facing many, many challenges. And I would like to ask her to tell us how she believes that in a position, if she is selected as a DG, she would see the future of the organization and of multilateral trading system. What would be the main issues that she would like to address? And as I already mentioned, it would also be important for us to hear from the point of view of Latin American countries, why does she think that the WTO is an important organization? So once again, Ngozi, it's very nice to see you and again, and I hope we'll have a very productive webinar. Ngozi, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. It's an absolute pleasure to see you again, and you haven't changed that much. So I'm going to, what I tried to do was to gather my thoughts succinctly into a statement in order to save time. So I want to address the issues you raised, if you don't mind, through the statement, if that's okay with you. And it won't take more than the allotted time. So let me start by thanking all the members of the organization Punta del Este for having me. It's a very distinguished group that is well known, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be with so many excellencies around the room. So let me then start to say that since the creation of the GATT after World War II, the growth of trade has gone hand in hand with a large expansion of the global economy and has increased living standards around the world. As Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy in Nigeria and at the World Bank, I have seen directly how trade has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty in the developing world. WTO agreements and the GATT before that have helped to promote trade and transform the global economy by reducing trade barriers, by providing greater transparency, predictability, and stability to trade relations, and by ensuring the efficient settlement of disputes. The WTO is an important instrument of economic growth and sustainable development and fulfills a key purpose in the world economy and in global governance by ensuring our shared prosperity and sustainability. The Latin American and Caribbean region plays a key role in the multilateral trading system and is an important force at the WTO. From the famous Uruguay round to the 11th ministerial in Buenos Aires, where incidentally, among other things, a declaration in empowering women and trade was signed by no less than 119 members, to the chairing of the dispute settlement body by Honduras, and the fisheries subsidies negotiations by Colombia, Latin America is an inescapable heavyweight at the WTO. And I must have had the pleasure of meeting with the whole Latin American and Caribbean group and speaking with them in Geneva. Despite its fundamental role, the WTO is not in a good place right now. In recent years, the multilateral trading system has been going through difficult and challenging times. The negotiating function of the WTO has produced only a few multilateral negotiating outcomes since its establishment 25 years ago, namely in the trade facilitation area in 2013 and the decision to eliminate all forms of agricultural export subsidies in 2015. There's a lack of trust among the members, resulting in the gridlock of the WTO's work. WTO ministerial conferences have become synonymous with inaction and squabbling among the membership, preventing decisive measures being adopted to address the many challenges facing the multilateral trading system. Instead of investing political capital in WTO negotiations, several countries are focusing their attention and energy on bilateral and regional trade agreements, which are relatively easier to negotiate among countries with common interests. Recourse to unilateral measures to resolve trade conflicts has increased further polarizing the membership. There are sharp differences among members on many subjects, including the value of having a two-stage dispute settlement process, differentiation among developing countries, and the form of special and differential treatment, which should, the form it should take going forward, and then how to conduct negotiations and over what subjects. There are also questions over the structure of the WTO Secretariat and how it could be reformed to best serve the members. To rebuild trust among WTO members and reclaim the organization's credibility, it is critical that members successfully conclude a negotiation and produce a new significant agreement. That is why I believe that the fisheries subsidies negotiations is a key candidate in the short term, given the state of discussions and the topic's importance from both an economic and sustainability standpoint. Members should bridge the gaps in their positions on overfishing, overcapacity, and special and differential treatment, particularly as it relates to small-scale and artisanal fisheries. A positive outcome, in my view, would signal two things. One, we care about sustainability and biodiversity of our oceans. And two, the WTO is back. And the WTO can overcome challenges, notwithstanding the divergent views among the membership on a number of issues. Regaining trust starts with small steps. That's my belief, to reinforce the common interest that all countries have in a well-functioning multilateral trading system. There's a convergence of views among WTO members that a broken trading system would not be in the interest of anyone. History tells us that almost every country was affected by the Great Depression in the 1930s. This COVID crisis has reminded us once again how interconnected our economies and our countries are. The economic fallout from the COVID crisis has impacted negatively on almost every country, most of whom are now trying to combat the recession. It took cooperation among members to come out of all the crises we've been in, including the latest 2008-2009 financial and food crisis. It will take cooperation for us to rebuild our economies post-COVID and lay the foundation for sustained economic growth and prosperity going forward. And the WTO should be part of that. My vision is for a WTO with purpose, seeking to use trade to support higher living standards and shared prosperity across countries and across the globe, including, of course, in the Latin American region. A WTO where there is greater trust among members and a renewed commitment to its core objectives and principles, including a determination to overcome the challenges that have paralyzed the organization in the last 2 decades. Apart from successfully concluding the fisheries negotiations, we need to make substantive progress on agriculture, an issue of great importance to the LAC region. As I've often stated, members should avoid drawing red lines and agree to address issues in the domestic support pillar concurrently. As has been pointed out by the KENS group of members, many of which come from this region, the current entitlement of members, aggregate measurement of support plus de minimis, is around $700 billion and approaching a trillion. It is thus important for domestic support to be addressed on a more neutral basis, placing all on the table for a fresh look. A positive outcome on agriculture that assures a more level playing field should help the economies of this region to rebound from the pandemic and achieve robust economic growth and sustainable development. Beyond agriculture, the Latin America region has a potential in trading services. It is not surprising that a number of LAC countries were active participants in the now stalled trade in services agreement negotiations. Several LAC countries are also active participants in the plurilateral negotiations, with some participating in all three of them: e-commerce, investment facilitation, and domestic regulation. The share of trade in services in world trade has been on an upward trend, and this will continue well into the future. The COVID crisis has underscored the need for the WTO rulebook to be updated and extended to e-commerce. A liberalized services sector will generate jobs in the LAC region and elsewhere and underpin economic recovery and growth. I would encourage participants in the plurilateral negotiations to consider extending outcomes on an MFN basis and have open accession clauses in these areas. Once trust is restored among members, the WTO should be confident to recommence negotiations in areas such as non-agricultural market access and subsidies, including those provided by state-owned enterprises. There's also a need to extend the WTO rulebook to issues such as trade and environment and climate change. There is a need to sharpen focus on the green economy. Trade results in carbon emissions, either through the method of production or transportation, be it road, air, and maritime. The interface between trade and environment and climate change merits greater attention at the WTO. Discussion should commence on the tools that could provide a boost to the green economy, whilst ensuring that any measures are non-discriminatory and not a disguised restriction on trade. As a DG, if I'm selected, I will work very hard to find solutions to another problem, which is the stalemate over dispute settlement. For a long time, what distinguished the WTO from other international organizations is its unique dispute settlement system. As stated in the DSU agreement, the dispute settlement system is a central element in guaranteeing security and predictability to the multilateral trading system. The systemic concerns expressed by members have to be satisfactorily addressed so that we can restore the DSS. In reforming it, independence and impartiality is key. The LAC region has been an active user in this dispute settlement system, and it is important, I know, to them as well as to other members that this be restored as soon as possible. There's, of course, the need to address the divisive issue of special and differential treatment, highly politically charged issue. It won't be easy. This will not be easy at all. But I believe that the approach adopted in the Trade Facilitation Agreement could offer a way forward to the membership in this area, taking into account each country's particular development situation. Another important challenge, in my view, is to ensure the participation in international trade of all countries and all groups within countries. We must have a WTO that works to the benefit of all members, regardless of size, level of development, or situation. LDCs and small economies should have opportunities to participate in regional and global value chains to enhance their participation in the multilateral trading system. One of the challenges facing developing countries is trade finance, and I know that this is not often mentioned or talked about. But following the financial crisis of 2008-2009, a lot of actions in the regulatory frameworks of developed countries have led to a decrease in correspondence banking and to access for business people in developing countries for trade finance. And I think this is something that the WTO should band together with other organizations to address. Of course, the WTO is not a financing agency, but were I to be made DG, I would work very hard to bring other organizations, private and public banks, to support business people in developing countries and support them with access to trade finance. The WTO will also have to confront the additional set of trade issues brought about by the COVID crisis. Maybe because I'm a WHO envoy to the Tools Accelerator and also chair of Gavi, I'm in the middle of this issue now, and I'm particularly concerned about issues of accessibility and affordability of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics to members of the WTO. In fact, to all members, there's no way that we can allow rich countries to be at the front of the queue, getting vaccines and therapeutics, and poor countries behind. This is what we're trying to solve in the Tools Accelerator. And I believe that trade has something a role to play here in the WTO. I think in the TRIPS agreement, we have certain clauses or that will enable us to deal with this issue of a public health emergency, that will allow countries to license the production of certain therapeutics and vaccines and make them accessible and affordable to their people, as was done with HIV/AIDS, without damaging the intellectual property issue and rights of those who have developed it. But I would have thought the WTO would be more visible on this issue and trying to be part of the solution. But what we see is 90 countries have export restrictions on medical supplies and equipment. It has been so hard for many developing countries to get access to these medical supplies and equipment. Some have even restricted food imports for food import dependent countries. This is a very difficult issue. So I just want to say that this is an area I actually think WTO can be part of the solution, and I'm very concerned. Were I to be DG, this would be one of the first things I'd put on the table for a solution, because we're right in the middle of it now. Needless to say that I also see trade and WTO as part of the solution of coming out of the recession that has been induced by this pandemic. Trade can help us recover and boost our economies going forward. I think the WTO rules should promote inclusiveness and participation. I'm passionate about the issue of micro, medium, and small enterprises and women in trade. These are, although trade has lifted millions into prosperity, but there are also those left behind by globalization. And I think the multilateral trading system and WTO rules should work harder to focus on this area so we can see how these can participate in the global and regional value chains. I know my frequent story I tell of a month ago, 30 women in Rwanda selling 30 tons of coffee on the internet and getting $4 more per ton, which is a lot of money than they would have because they were able to participate. This is what I want to see the WTO focusing on. And yet, issues of e-commerce, the rules are not there. And this is one of the areas we need to move forward on. Finally, it will be important to strengthen the Secretariat itself so that it can act in a more coordinated and, as the British would say, joined up fashion to support members better in their negotiations, implementation, and monitoring. An effective Secretariat is key to an effective WTO. And then strengthening the Secretariat, I would also want to see it reflect a bit more the diversity of the WTO members, be it from a gender perspective or even from a nationality perspective. Of course, as a former finance minister, I know the budget is very small. And so what you can do at the margin is not that much. But within the leeway we have, this is an area I think would be of interest were I to be DG. Now, let me end by saying that all these reforms require a combination of skills that is needed to turn the WTO around, working with members. It's not an issue of technical negotiating skills, because if it were, there's an abundance of that, not only within the Secretariat, but among members. What is needed now is strong political and reform skills, the ability to do reform that is needed to turn the organization around. And that is what I'm saying. I'm one of the, I'm a participant or competitor who has actually done reform. I don't talk about it, whether it's at the World Bank or 7 years as finance minister in my country and coordinating minister of the economy. I've written 2 books about reform. So for me, it's practice, not theory. And I would bring this. I would bring strong managerial skills for being number 2, managing director operations at the World Bank. I would bring the COVID experience that no other competitor has and that can help the WTO solve the problems confronting us now. Consensus building, listening, and a fresh face and a fresh pair of eyes and ears. This is what WTO needs now to be able to turn itself around. It cannot be business as usual. We cannot continue with the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ngozi. And I would like just to remind colleagues that are participating in the webinar that they can pose questions through the chat mechanism of the webinar. So let's start with a few questions that I have already received. Well, one I'm lying, I didn't receive, but I had this in mind, which is probably the elephant in the room. How you would deal with the trade frictions between China and the United States, and also different views about the multilateral trade system. Another question, this one put by Hector Torres, he basically points out you have been Minister of Finance, also Foreign Affairs, and held managerial positions at the World Bank. You have first-hand knowledge of the challenges facing developing countries, and you have direct access to government officials in many capitals. This is one of your strong points. How do you plan to use it? So these are the 2 initial questions for us to start this conversation. Back to you. And
Thank you so much, Carlos. As you said, one very tough and two important questions. Well, of course, let me start by saying China and US are seen as the elephant in the room with the frictions and the escalating tension. But there's also, some tension between EU and US. There's also between developing and developed countries. And it all boils down to what I've observed talking to members, a lack of trust among the membership. And I think that you cannot really begin to make progress until you begin to build trust. And building trust, you can't do it by talking about it. You need some confidence building measures in order for this to work. So my approach is, despite all these differences that I listed and all the problems we're talking about, is to turn around the question a little bit and say, where are there some commonalities? Let's take between the 2 big countries. Where are there some things that they agree on that we can begin to build on? And before even doing that, I would say, let us separate the WTO problems from other political problems and be careful not to let the WTO get ensnared and snapped up in other problems. But coming to WTO issues, I'd be looking for areas of common ground to build on. And I tell you right off the bat, the fact that the fisheries subsidies negotiation is a multilateral one with everyone around the table. China is there, America is there, Latin America is there, Europe is there. This is something to be considered important. And that is why I insist on it, because it would demonstrate that working together, these 2 elephants in the room with others, because I consider the views of small countries and developing countries and others important, can indeed accomplish something, can have a win. You will not imagine in my career and experience when you have such difficulties, building from a win can really help to establish confidence and build on. So this is how I would start. I would tackle another problem to help bridge the divide. Yes, on the dispute settlement system. I think I would put this on the table. Why? Because I believe a win in that area will help to bridge a lot of differences. Why can we do it now? Before we've had some work. the work of on the MPIA, the work of Ambassador Walker and his process. But now, a few days ago, Ambassador Lighthizer put on paper what the US is looking for. Before, everybody knew what they didn't want. Now they know what they want in such a system. So for me, this is the beginning of work. I would put a work program together around those issues. One thing is common. Everybody wants the dispute settlement system. How you arrive there is different, but at least we have a basis to work. And I think this would help to bridge gaps if we come to this. Finally, and this relates to the second question, leveraging access. I believe that at this point in time, being able to reach the decision makers, and helping to unravel some of these issues is very important. That is where, as was mentioned, my access to top officials would come in. And of course, this is not something I go saying in public or anything like that, but at least having spent a long time in Washington, one has built several platforms over many administrations. Having been traveling to China for the past 30 years, maintaining the ties, one also has platforms. I'm on the board of, advisory board of the Asian Infrastructure Bank at this moment. I'm on the advisory board of Tsinghua University School of Public Policy. These are weighty organizations. There's a lot to build on. So using these platforms and reaching the officials to try to leverage would also be part of the process. Now, let me end by saying none of this is going to be easy. It will require hard work, but it's doable. Thank you.
Very good. So we have now several new questions. Let me start with Xiangkun Lu, who asked, what's your view on the informal process of the WTO, such as the Green Room meetings? Do you plan to use such informal processes, particularly among the major players?
Thank you very much for that question. I've heard a lot about the Green Room and a lot of, concern and so on around it as well. Of course, my attitude is that, look, when we are dealing in trying to unlock difficulties among members and to come to agreement, we will use every instrument that we can use, including the Green Room. But how you use it can be somewhat different. So yes, it is important you have to bring the big players, some of them because it begins to give you a basis for an agreement that can then be found out to others. But other players can also come in, and I mean to actively use it, not exactly in the manner it was used before, but in a much more inclusive manner. So I think as an instrument, it will help, but the manner in which I might use it as DG might be slightly different. I want to state unabashedly that I believe that the views of small countries matter, the views of poor countries matter, and I do not see a multi-tier or multi-step WTO. In doing my work, I'm there for all, and I would make sure they're all involved in any process I'm doing in one way or the other.
Okay, now a question close to your heart. You had already mentioned several aspects of the implications of the COVID pandemic, and as you see the importance for the WTO to have a more active role in this process. So Anrita Bari has asked, it seems like the very first thing in the to-do list of the next DG would be to prepare a multilateral response to the pandemic and the development and distribution of vaccines as and when we have one that works, one or several. How will you prepare such a response amidst rapidly increasing nationalism to ensure that poor countries are not made to stand forever in the queue to get the vaccines?
Well, thank you so much for that question, which, as you say, really is a question to my heart because I'm very concerned about it. I think there are two things to share. One is that there's an international effort afoot right now, which has a combination of the WHO, the Gavi, which I chair the board, as full disclosure, and CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. which invests or is investing in the portfolio of vaccines as they're being developed. And so this coalition, along with members of the international community, and you recognize that the EC, the European Commission, held a fundraising and many countries were present, have started this international effort for the Tools Accelerator to accelerate any therapeutics and diagnostics and vaccines that could be made available. In doing that, we've developed what is called a COVAX facility with 2 branches. This COVAX facility is designed to allow developing country members to have access at affordable prices. There are 92 countries for which we will launch an advanced market commitment to try and get vaccines purchased or committed along with the developed countries who are also purchasing. There's another arm of self-financing countries, and we're all banding together for volume purchases. But along the way, there will be a need to also see whether production of some of these therapeutics or vaccines can be done in developing countries, making it more accessible, because the manufacture of billions of doses has never been done before. We are looking for 2 billion doses to start with, and it could be much more than that. So you need the manufacturing capability, and that's where the WTO and the agreement. So on my to-do list would immediately be indeed at the next MC12, which parts of our agreements are relevant to making it easier for countries to have access so we can avoid this vaccine nationalism that is already afoot. And there are several sections, I mentioned them, where we used it for HIV/AIDS drugs, where, South Africa, for instance, was allowed to license the production of certain drugs in a manner that still protected the intellectual property. We mustn't forget that. So those would be the things tabled. Let members look at these and let us unleash the rules that can be part of the solution. Let us also look for the long term, because this is not the only pandemic we are going to have, so that we have rules in place that can be triggered to help the world. And we don't have to sit around in order to get things done, but we can come together immediately because we have prepared for it. So these are some of the things. Let me end the section by saying that, of course, on the to-do list is the lifting of export restrictions that I mentioned. 90 countries have export restrictions. I think 28 of them have taken this off, and several of them had declared. But many of these countries did not notify, and it was not done in a transparent manner. And it's not temporary, proportionate, and transparent that the way WTO rules would want it. So we need to tackle this. And this would be included in the basket of issues that I would want members to look at.
Very good. Now from Bernard Hockman, he asks the following. In a recent survey of trade practitioners, respondents place doing more analysis of distributional and implicitly economic effects of trade policies. They put this issue last in terms of priority for the WTO. But lack of such analysis, arguably, is a core reason for criticism of the WTO. And doing such analysis is critical to identify what is important to address. What would you do as DG to establish the evidence base that is needed to get countries to focus on issues like that?
Well, I happen to actually agree that I think that, more analysis could be done so that we can focus on what we can do, especially on inequality and distributional impacts of trade. None of us can deny that part of the problem we're in now as a globe is the fact that, yes, globalization worked, but it left certain people within countries behind, whereas inequality has narrowed between countries, not completely, but well. But within countries, there are issues, and that's why we have the populism and nationalism we see. So and trade is one of the key instruments, for the development of economy. So keeping on top of the impact trade is having, particularly this issue of distributional impact, I think is key. We can't avoid it anymore. also doing analysis about the negotiating positions of members. I've talked to certain members, and sometimes they take positions which are of long standing. Sometimes they take it for political issues, but analysis of those positions are not really done. I think the WTO Secretariat does quite a lot. It has very talented staff working very hard, but maybe more could be done along the lines. I would not put it last in a survey, this issue of the impact of trade and distribution, because for me it matters. That's why I'm speaking about micro, medium, and small enterprises and women in trade, because I'm looking for a way for trade to be more inclusive. So I would place this very much at the top of my priority of work, along with other pieces of analysis to support members' positions or dissuade them from the positions if the cost-benefit ratio of those positions becomes very much evident that it would not be to their advantage.
Well, music to my ears, and I imagine to Bernard's also. But Bernard also put in the same vein the following question, because of course, we need countries to focus on issues where spillovers are the greatest. How to get countries to agree on a work program on subsidies and industrial policy?
Yeah, as you said, one of the things really bedeviling the WTO is the negative spillovers that we have from policy impact of certain members and so on, and the feeling that these negative spillovers have led to the balance of rights and obligations that members and other members entered into being displaced. There's this perception, and so you have to tackle it. But with regard to industrial subsidies, a very delicate area. 3 or 4 members have actually done some work. I think Japan, along with the EU and the US, have been looking at issues of what might be, a program of work that could be looking at how to either strengthen the disciplines existing on these issues, or whether it's necessary to introduce new disciplines in the area. And I believe that this should be tabled, the suggestions and recommendations, and we should then certainly start to listen to other members and their views on the issues of industrial subsidies and negative spillovers. It's a very sensitive issue. I think it requires a lot of listening and building consensus on the way forward. But I think a work program focused around evidence-based impacts of the spillovers, along with remedies to deal with them, would be, I think, a way to go forward.
Okay, we have several questions from former WTO ambassadors. One from Fernando de Mateo asking, would you give priority in reaching ministers or ambassadors? Would you deal with opposing views? How would you deal with opposing views on special and differential treatment? And from Alejandro Jara, so Fernando de Mateo, the former ambassador from Mexico, Alejandro Jara, not only the former ambassador of Chile, but also a former deputy director general. He asks, what can the Secretariat do to enhance transparency?
Yeah, sorry, okay, thank you. 2 very important questions. In fact, 3 questions. The first one is, how would I handle ministers and ambassadors? In my view, from what I've learned and seen over the years, both are important. I do not think you can work without the ambassadors who do the negotiations and the ministers who also do the negotiations. In my view, the policies positions are often taken within the capital. So there'll be a need to work with ministers, because that's where you can begin to unravel some of the knotty issues that develop. So you cannot say you cannot work without that you can work without the ministers. So they'll be reaching out. That's what I would do. Equally, you have to reach out to the ambassadors who are here in Geneva and dealing with the issues on a daily basis. So I would do both. For me, it's not either or. And I think then it means that you have to have a very competent managerial team because when you're out working, you know, I think the DDGs, for instance, should be very effective. I'm part of the management team. I mean, I've done at the World Bank, you know, this is something we're used to doing, to having the team, managerial team meeting often, working together, being able to act in the absence of a principal so that the principal can take on some other duties. It's not even just meeting ministers. There's a need for quite a bit of advocacy on behalf of the WTO, because to me, it's such an important organization. Many people have devoted their lives and careers, and we need to lift it up to where it should be. This is one of the things I would focus on. With regard to special and differential treatment, this is probably one of the most divisive issues within the organization. I do not think that there's any debate about the special and differential treatment for the least developed countries. That is an agreed thing from almost everyone. The issue comes when you have the medium developing country category, if you want to call it that, and the feeling that some members you know, are really well off and have high per capita incomes and should not be in this category. Of course, some members on their own, like Chinese Taipei and Singapore, Brazil, have decided and said they would not partake of special and differential treatment. But I believe that the best way to go about it is on a case-by-case, negotiation-by-negotiation basis. The trade facilitation agreement points the way, where you don't have to spend time on labels and categories, but you should look at what level, what can each country agree to and implement within their level of development? What sort of assistance and timeline do they need to do it? I believe if you go this individual way and negotiations by negotiations, where you still achieve what is wanted, which is a proper balance of rights and obligations without getting into the labeling issue. So that's the way I would go about it. With regard to the secretariat, sorry,
how to enhance transparency.
And how to enhance transparency. I think that the monitoring function of the secretariat is where I would lay emphasis. You know, there are many agreements entered into, there are obligations entered into, but the extent to which these are tracked and monitored is varied. And that is not, I mean, there are several reasons for it. Some countries have the political will to be transparent and declare and notify, but they don't have the resources and the ability to do it, and they need assistance. And the secretariat can be very, very helpful with this, including using the instruments at hand like Aid for Trade and other things that can assist countries to put up whatever electronic platforms or engage in those already there. But there are countries that have the wherewithal, the knowledge and everything, but they don't have the political will to be transparent and to declare. That's another kettle of fish. I don't think we should mix them together because that's a difficult one. And we'd have to see with those countries, why are they not willing to be transparent or notify or declare what changes in their trade regimes? So the Secretariat may have to work with them. It may be more of a political approach, but a different approach to find out why and to try and unravel this. So I think that monitoring function is crucial. And that's what I would be strengthening if I were DG, along with some other things.
Okay. Rita Bari again asked another question, which is the following. WTO rule book does not have a single gender or women explicit provision. The 2017 declaration is completely non-binding. What steps would you take to ensure that multilateral regulation can make foreign trade work for enhancing women empowerment?
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the areas we agree that the WTO needs to step up, both because enhancing women's participation in the economy in any country contributes substantially to the GDP of that country, but also because it supports employment, it supports participation in the economy, and so on and so forth. So on this issue, I think there's need. You're right, the declaration that was signed in Buenos Aires was not binding, but it was still comforting to me to see that 119 countries signed it. And based on that goodwill to do something concrete, I would try to develop a work program. I mean, specifically when I'm thinking of women in trade and so on, I'm very much focused on how can we support women to more within the digital economy initially, because it shows such promise. You know, I'm a very pragmatic person. So I think that looking at the rules around e-commerce offers great possibilities to involve small enterprises, many of whom, at least in many of our developing countries, over 50% of micro, medium, and small enterprises creating jobs are owned by women. And I would be focusing on women entrepreneurship issues. They are, of course, behind the border issues that have to be dealt with. It's not only trade that can solve that problem. Governments have to have their own policies. You know, they have to remove red tape that prevent women-owned businesses from thriving. They have to be supportive, ensure that they have access to credit. They have marketing skills that can help them. So we need to look at behind the border issues and then couple that with when we are looking at the rules for e-commerce, what within these rules would be enhancing to help women get onto electronic platforms and do their trade. They are so creative. You go there now, you see women in my own country, they are making masks out of African cloth like what I'm wearing, and they are selling this on the internet. All sorts of other things that are being made. So it's quite exciting, and I would see that the rule book could be changed, beginning with e-commerce.
Okay, from another World Bank alumnus, Joe Ingram, who had extensive experience with the WTO when he was the World Bank representative in Geneva. WTO has been criticized for being insensitive to the need for trade agreements to be more responsive to worker labor rights and to the impact of global warming. Do you agree? And if so, what you would do to address these concerns?
Yes, I do agree with some of these statements to a substantial extent, with caveats. Whatever we do to right these areas of labor rights and global warming must be done in a way that does not restrict trade, and it's not used as a means of preventing developing countries from, you know, having the policy space some of them need, especially the least developed, to be able to advance their countries. That being said, yes, I'll be very concerned about labor issues. I would be looking to work with the ILO. This is where it is great to have other international organizations that also look at some of these issues to see how we can be more reflective of that agenda, which is also part of our sustainable development goals of leaving no one behind and not discriminating against anyone. On global warming, I already said it, that the green agenda is the rules are not up to date on this issue. Again, without restricting the ability of developing countries to be able to have the policy space, I would look at, you know, issues of carbon emissions and what trade is contributing to that, be it for maritime, air, or whatever means of transport, and what could be done in a friendly way to reduce this in a corporate. And then I would look at, you know, shifting to renewables as much as possible. So within trade, we could be looking and saying, okay, are there products, you know, that are very carbon intensive, which could be made in a much more carbon friendly way and, you know, and be traded? You know, what about deforestation and the carbon sinks we have? What happens, you know, if you're cutting down trees to plant palm trees, and they're working with organizations and corporations that are doing that to come about it in a much more climate friendly way. So these are some of the things I think trade could be looking at how to enhance those. So Yeah, that would be my response.
Okay, Ngozi, I know that you have a very hard agenda issue in 5 minutes, so we are coming to closure. But we have 2 final questions, and then I'll give you a few minutes for you to address the participants as you wish. So one question comes from Paulina Nazal, where she says the following: different from other international organizations that have an implemented structure, how do you plan to approach the private sector and civil society in general to bring the WTO closer to the real needs of the countries and the less favored interest groups with globalization, women, small and medium enterprise? The G20 has interest groups like the B20, the W20. Related to the previous question, how will the management of the WTO approach if the world continue with one of the most influential countries in the world so opposed to multilateral cooperation? For example, on issues that you mentioned, such as climate change, or in a new crisis such as the health crisis we are experiencing. So, actually, these are several questions.
No, you know, one was both in the health crisis and what was the other crisis?
The climate change crisis.
Okay.
From the point of view that one of the most influential countries, I have no idea
which
who
one
she is thinking of, is not very favorable to multilateral cooperation.
Okay, so well, with respect to the first question on private sector and civil society, I actually think this is, I will be very frank, really, really important. You know, I think there was a time the WTO was challenged with demonstrations and, you know, civil society feeling left out and, you know, blocking the discussions and negotiations like in Seattle. At the World Bank, we went through that 20 years ago. 50 years is enough campaign. And we reached out with a program to engage civil society. So of course, the WTO has the big forum where it has civil society and private sector even all participating. But I sense, you know, a bit of a waning in talking to civil society itself and to private sector. And by the way, business is one of the biggest fans and supporters of WTO. It is amazing to me, whether it's women in business or chambers of commerce or just business people, just how they think about the WTO as very important, contrary to some of the image. So it would be very, very important to bring them in. I would reach out, you know, with particular fora, you know, so they can be listened to. One of the things, of course, that bothers business is the dispute settlement system that is paralyzed. So working on that would be of direct service to them, but I would endeavor to reach out because I believe their views matter, and you cannot have a WTO that is not sensitive to business. What are you doing it for at the end of the day? Similarly, CSOs, women reaching out to grassroots. What distresses me is that sometimes people at grassroots don't even know what the WTO is, or what it stands for, what it's doing for them, the common or ordinary person, and why it's even there. And I think this is a very big gap that the WTO has to address. I do not think that having just one big public forum to do this, or, you know, it needs to be thought through. What is it that needs to be done to make ordinary people believe that this is an organization that also works for them? I would be very focused on that because I think it's necessary. And whether it is through organizations like, I'm not, you know, the G20 has developed B20, W20 and all, I'm not quite sure if that's the way I would go, but I would definitely have in mind, you know, some fora in which I could gather these two segments of our society and business world and be able to talk to them. And the WTO has to get going. You cannot have a situation, for instance, in which the T20, because you forgot there's also T20, is, you know, released a document that was talking about reforms at the WTO and asking for the G20 for permission to work on these reforms. So that shows there's a big gap. WTO ought to be working on those reforms, yes, with the T20, but they ought to be the primary actor, not having reform done to them. They should be in the lead. And when I saw that document, I said WTO needs to do much, much more. On the issue of, the dissension in the world and with respect to climate change and health, we've now lived through some turbulent times and on these issues. And we've seen how, when we're interconnected and working in solidarity, we can solve problems better and faster, as we did during the financial crisis. But I should also say that the world, to some extent, has also exhibited a will to go on and to try and find solutions. They're not perfect, but they're working. So with respect to health, we've got this international facility called the COVAX facility and the Tools Accelerator that is housed in the WHO, and it's working. So I think that, we don't throw up our hands in the air. We gather a coalition of the willing, and we try to solve the problems, even if some big members are not there. And we continue to speak to the big members, because maybe certain aspects of the big members are interested in working. Ditto climate change. There are certain states, certain groups, that continue to be interested in some of these issues, and we should continue to court them and invite them into whatever international framework and multilateral framework we have. I'm a strong proponent of multilateralism and will continue to support it. Thank you.
Ngozi, on behalf of the Punta del Este Group, I would like to thank you for taking the time, talking to all of us and expose your ideas if you were to become the next Director General. Just two brief comments. One, the importance of the relationship with the private sector that you pointed out is very important for trade. And one thing that comes to my mind when I was the director of the Avian Group and at IMD in Lausanne, we had meetings with CEOs of large companies. And when I asked them what comes to your mind when I say the word WTO, and the most common answer was frustration. Mm-hmm. So they recognize the importance, but they also live in a world characterized by much greater velocity than the one that multilateral trade negotiations take. Final point, I was amazed by the fact that you didn't bring one word to the discussion. I know that it's very close to your heart, the issue of corruption. But I'm sure if we had more time, we would hear from you what can the WTO do in this important area. So you have the last word.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you so much. So many good questions and a wonderful audience to engage with. Thank you, making me think, go through my paces. And yes, on corruption, I can spend the next 3 hours talking about it. I've written a book, which was just published by MIT Press about it. So I'll leave people to read that. But I think I want to leave members with this last word. I care deeply about the multilateral trading system because I think the 21st century, we need it, it's relevant. I care deeply about the WTO. I'm passionate about trade. And it is so obvious that we need to do something very deep and quick to turn this organization around. It's painful. When you read article after article, the WTO is irrelevant, it's leaderless, it's this, it's that. We have to stop this. And I'm telling you, to do it, it cannot be business as usual. WTO members have to have the courage to take a DG courageous, who can do the needed reforms working with members and deliver the change that is needed. Just remember, no business as usual, no status quo. We have to go for change to make the WTO work better for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi. All the best. And let me remind the audience that tomorrow we'll have another webinar now with Mr. Mohammed Maziad Al-Tawajiri, who is also one of the candidates to the position of Director General of the WTO. Stay safe. Thank you for the audience. Thank to you in particular, Ngozi. Bye now.
Bye, Carlos. Bye, everybody. Bye, Joe.
Thank you very much.
Fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.